Hello everyone, today we read and comment the fourth paragraph of the 14th chapter of the fifth book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, its title being Subsistence from Magazines. The text follows. If we are to make a generic distinction between this method of subsisting troops and the preceding, it must be by an organization such as existed for about 30 years at the close of the 17th and during the 18th century. Can this organization ever reappear? Certainly we cannot conceive it can be dispensed with if great armies are to be bound down for 7, 10, or 12 years long to one spot, as they have been formerly in the Netherlands, on the Rhine, in Upper Italy, Silesia, and Saxony. For what country can continue for such a length of time to endure the burden of two great armies, making it the entire source of their supplies, without being utterly ruined in the end, and therefore gradually becoming unable to meet the demands? But here naturally arises the question, shall the war prescribe the system of subsistence, or shall the latter dictate the nature of the war? To this we answer, the system of subsistence will control the war in the first place as far as the other conditions of which it depends permit. But when the latter are encroached upon, the war will react on the subsistence system, and in such case determine the same. A war carried on by means of the system of requisitions and local supplies furnished on the spot has such an advantage over one carried in independence on issues from magazines that the latter does not look at all like the same instrument. No state will therefore venture to encounter the former with the latter, and if any war minister should be so narrow-minded and blind to circumstances as to ignore the real relation which the two systems bear to each other, by sending an army into the field to live upon the old system, the force of circumstances would carry the commander of that army along with it in its course, and the requisition system would burst forth of itself. If we consider besides that a great expense attending such an organization must necessarily reduce the extent of the armament in other respects, including of course the actual number of combatant soldiers, as no state has a superabundance of wealth, then there seems no probability of any such organization being again restored to unless it should be adopted by the belligerents by mutual agreement, an idea which is a mere play of the imagination. Wars therefore may be expected henceforward always to commence with the requisition system. How much one or other government will do to supplement the same by an artificial organization to spare their own country, etc., remains to be seen. That it will not be overmuch we may be certain, for at such moments the tendency is to look to the most urgent wants, and an artificial system of subsisting troops does not come under that category. But now, if a war is not so decisive in its results, if its operations are not so comprehensive as is consistent with its real nature, then the requisition system will begin to exhaust the country in which it is carried on to that degree that either peace must be made, or means must be found to lighten the burden on the country and to become independent of it for the supplies of the army. The latter was the case of the French army under Bonaparte in Spain, but the first happens much more frequently. In most wars, the exhaustion of the state increases to that degree that, instead of thinking of prosecuting the war at a still greater expense, the necessity for peace becomes so urgent as to be imperative. Thus, from this point of view, the modern method of carrying on war has a tendency to shorten the duration of wars. At the same time, we shall not positively deny the possibility of the old system of subsistence reappearing in future wars. It will perhaps be restored to by belligerents hereafter where the nature of their mutual relations urge them to it, and circumstances are favorable to its adoption. But we can never perceive in that system a natural organization. It is much rather an abnormal growth permitted by circumstances, but which can never spring from war in its true sense. Still less can we consider that former system as an improvement in war on the ground of its being more humane, for war itself is not a humane proceeding. Whatever method of providing subsistence may be chosen, chosen, it is but natural that it should be more easily carried out in rich and well-peopled countries than in the midst of a poor and scanty population. That the population should be taken into consideration lies in the double relation which that element bears to the quantity of provisions to be found in a country. First, because where the consumption is large, the provision to meet that consumption is also large, and in the next place, because as a rule a large population produces also largely. From this we must certainly accept districts peopled chiefly by manufacturers, particularly when, as is often the case, such districts lie in mountain valleys surrounded by unproductive land. But in the generality of cases, it is always very much easier to feed troops in a well-populated than in a thinly inhabited country. An army of 100,000 men cannot be supported on 400 square miles inhabited by 400,000 people, as well as it would be on 400 square miles with a population of 2 million inhabitants, even supposing the soil equally good in two cases. Besides, the roads and means of water carriage are much better in rich countries and afford a greater choice. Being more numerous, the means of transport are more abundant, the commercial relations easier and more certain. In a word, there is infinitely less difficulty in supporting an army in Flanders than in Poland. The consequence is that war with its manifold succors fixes itself by preference along high roads, near populous towns, in the fertile valleys of large rivers, or along such sea coasts as are well frequented. This shows clearly how the subsistence troops may have a general influence upon the direction and form of military undertakings, and upon the choice of theater of war and lines of communication. The extent of this influence, what weight shall attach to the facility or difficulty of provisioning the troops, all that in the calculation depends very much on the way in which the war is to be conducted. If it is to be carried on its real spirit, that is, with the unbridled force which belongs to its element, with a constant pressing forward too, or seeking for the combat and decisive solution, then the sustenance of the troops, although unimportant, is but a subordinate affair. But if there is to be a state of equilibrium during which the armies move about here and there in the same province for several years, then the subsistence must often become the principal thing, the intendant, the commander-in-chief, and the conduct of the war an administration of wagons. There are numberless campaigns of this kind in which nothing took place. The plans miscarried, forces were used to no purpose, the only excuse being the plea of a want of subsistence. On the other hand, Bonaparte used to say, "Qu'on ne me parle pas de vivre." Certainly, that general in the Russian campaign proved that such recklessness may be carried too far, for not to say that perhaps his whole campaign was ruined through that cause alone, which at best would be only a supposition, still it is beyond doubt that to his want of regarding to the subsistence of his troops he was indebted for the extraordinary melting away of his army on his advance, and for its utter ruin on the retreat. But while fully recognizing in Bonaparte the eager gambler who ventures on many a mad extreme, we may justly say that he and the revolutionary generals who preceded him dispelled a powerful prejudice in respect to the subsistence of troops, and showed that it should never be looked upon in any other light than as a condition of war, never as an object. Besides, it is with privation in war just as with physical exertion and danger. The demands which the general can make on his army are without any defined bounds. An iron character demands more than a feeble, sensitive man. Also the endurance of an army differs in degree, according as habit, military spirit, confidence in an affection towards the commander, or enthusiasm for the cause of the fatherland, sustain the will and energy of the soldier. But this may be looked upon as an established principle, that privation and want, however far they may be carried, should never be otherwise regarded than as transition states which should be succeeded by a state of abundance, indeed even by superfluity. Can there be anything more touching than the thought of so many thousand soldiers badly clothed with packs on their backs weighing 30 or 40 pounds, toiling over every kind of road, in every description of weather, for days and days, continually on the march, health and life forever in peril, and for all that unable to get a sufficiency of dry bread. And one who knows how often this happens in war is at a loss to know how it does not oftener lead to a refusal of the will and powers to submit any longer to such exactions, and how the mere bent constantly given to the imagination of human beings in one direction is capable of first calling forth and then supporting such incredible efforts. Let any one then who imposes great privations in his men because great objects demand such a trial of endurance always bear in mind, as a matter of prudence, if not prompted to by his own feelings, that there is a recompense for such sacrifices which is bound to pay at some other time. We have now to consider the difference which takes place in respect to the question of subsistence in war, according as the action is offensive or defensive. The defensive is in a position to make uninterrupted use of subsistence which he has been able to lay in beforehand as long as his defensive act continues. The defensive side therefore can hardly be in want of the necessaries of life, particularly if he is in his own country, but even in the enemy's this holds good. The offensive, on the other hand, is moving away from his resources, and as long as it is advancing, and even during the first weeks after stops, must procure from day to day what it requires, and this can very rarely be done without want and inconvenience being felt. This difficulty is felt in its fullest force at two particular periods: first in the advance, before the decision takes place. Then the supplies of the defensive side are still at hand, whilst the assailant has been obliged to leave his behind. He is obliged to keep his masses concentrated, and therefore cannot spread his army over any considerable space. Even his transport cannot keep close to him when he commences his movements preliminary to a battle. If his preparations have not been very well made, it may easily happen at this moment that his army may be in want of supplies for several days before the decisive battle, which certainly is not a means of bringing them into the fight in the highest state of efficiency. The second time a state of want arises is at the end of a victorious career, if the lines of communication begin to be too long, especially if the war is carried on in a poor, sparsely populated country, and perhaps also in the midst of a people whose feelings are hostile. What an enormous difference between the line of communication from Vilna to Moscow, or which every carriage must be forcibly seized, and the line from Cologne by Liège, Louvain, Bruxelles, Mons, and Valenciennes to Paris, where a mercantile contract or a bill of exchange would suffice to procure millions of rations. Frequently has the difficulty we are now speaking of resulted in obscuring the splendor of the most brilliant victories, reduced to the powers of the victorious army, rendered retreat necessary, and then by degrees ended in producing all the symptoms of a real defeat. Forage, of which, as we have before said, there is usually at first the least deficiency, will run short soonest if a country begins to become exhausted, for it is the most difficult supply to procure from a distance, on account of its bulk, and the horse feels the effect of long feeding much sooner than the man. For this reason, an over-numerous cavalry and artillery may become a real burden and an element of weakness to an army. So, this is actually one of the most beautiful paragraphs we have read from the book. At least I enjoyed it greatly. Here, as if you have followed the last videos of the series, we are essentially listing the various means of subsistence of the armies from Clausewitz times, Napoleonic era, and we got to the end, right to the magazines. I mean, to the idea that fundamentally war has to be supplied also on a distance and in a prearranged state by those, by the polity that is leading the war. These three systems that, as we've seen, include the regular requisitions, the exactions enforced on by the troops themselves, and living off the land, right, on the inhabitants, the community, which is the same thing, always compenetrate each other. And in this final paragraph, von Clausewitz fundamentally observes altogether, not just the system of magazines, but also realizes how fundamentally war, at least for the form that had taken by that time, and we always stress here that von Clausewitz had never envisaged, ideally, the fact that war would never change, that this is a work about just Napoleonic warfare. This is meant to be about any time in history, to draw a theory of the art of war that is universally valid, and that still is, because all the world armed forces at the end of the day are trained on the base of von Clausewitz's theory. The question here is that war, in a sense, takes its own space, right, and form, in ways that do not depend just on the prearrangement of the systems. In this case, of the system of subsistence. This is very interesting to me because recently I had not a debate, it was a mild thing, loved one, about the concept of logistics that I found actually said by a person out there that does reenactment and also fights. It's just that, there is this idea that, fundamentally, if you're a kid, you speak of tactics, right? And if you are, a mature man, you speak of logistics fundamentally, as if logistics is really what makes war, doesn't it? The point is, if you've read this paragraph from Clausewitz, you realize that this is actually not the case. That when you speak of logistics, you're not even technically speaking of the theory of the art of war proper, right? Which assumes naturally the army to already be fully supplied, and that considers the logistical instances, like in this case, when these have come to have literally a strategical and tactical impact. It is to say, where the hell do you have to move your army and how? This doesn't tell you how you practically supply troops, and I think it's pretty banal to observe that, as it was said famously, an army walks on his stomach, basically, and the point here is that war, where if there was an army out there that relied on a supplying system that is more regular and that is enforced by the state, etc., at some point will still have to be fought, right? And if the circumstances occur in which this is the case, where, for example, you consume local, because this is the point of the idea that doesn't matter how how supplied an army is by the state. But fundamentally, armies of such size, like the ones depicted in here for the systems of supplies at the time, will always require to leave off the land in a measure. And basically all the three paragraphs that we've seen before explain why this is the case. So von Clausewitz is saying, even if, we'll reread it now, but even if there was a general so foolish that thinks that he can't sustain his sometimes even 100,000 men, just this hyper system of magazines sent by the homeland and so on, is something that requires an enormous cost, and not considering the living off the land, war will take its own control over logistics, right? Because it will have to be fought again for the reasons that brought to be fought in the first place, so that logistics is bent eventually to it. So that, of course, war is modified by logistics as well. This could be said for many things, right? This includes technology, for example. The idea that technology wins wars, no, right? It's doctrine that wins wars, if anything. And even if technology does help, it's always, the rest is always the upper hand. It's just a minimal part of the wall that is virtually insignificant compared to how and why wars are fought. And if you know what the Clausewitzian Trinity is about, we have began even to deepen a bit into that in this terrain playlist. We know that that's not in fact the case. So this is particularly important because it shows you how eventually there are also certain mechanics that you cannot ignore, right? It's not simply a matter of saying an opinion, it depends on how enforced something can more or less work. No, these armies are so bulky they will begin at some point to exact supplies in local, by billeting, by going house to house, and that is being proven to be the most convenient way, right, of doing things. It doesn't matter how inhumane it sounds effective. And the reasons why you fought that war, of course, are not the ways you fight that war are not humane definition, because war is not about that, right? But the motivations for it may or may not be. It's a wholly different thing. So here, as you understand, here we expand on multiple fields. But this is exactly what von Clausewitz wants us to do in this last paragraph, right? And it's very, very interesting to read. So, subsistence from magazines. So if we are to make a generic distinction between this method of subsisting troops and the preceding, von Clausewitz writes, it must be by an organization such as existed for about 30 years at the close of the 17th and during the 18th century. There is a time in which this thing was possible to do, as we've seen. Basically, armies were maintained for a long time in a theater of war that needed, therefore, supplies from the outside, but these were smaller armies, therefore that could be done. In a bad season, even, entrenchments remained with a few patrols, and literally armies went, spending the winter in outer camps. It was a dramatically colder in terms of kinetic energy war compared to what would, explode with mass warfare at the time of the French Revolution. So von Clausewitz questions, can this organization with magazines supplying armies at a long distance on a regular base ever reappear? So von Clausewitz says certainly, so armies that naturally, as we've just said, were actually smaller in the past when this was regularly done, and that now do not match with that, but by far, maybe by a large scale. So von Clausewitz says certainly we cannot conceive how it can be dispensed with if great armies are to be bound down for 7, 10, or 12 years long to one spot, as they have been formerly in the Netherlands, on the Rhine, in Upper Italy, Silesia, and Saxony. For what country can continue for such length of time to endure the burden of two great armies, making it the entire source of their supplies, without being utterly ruined in the end, and therefore gradually becoming unable to meet the demands? Right. So this is quite important. There are many examples one could make, but the obvious thing here is Napoleonic times, where those 100,000 men stay in these places for years and years and years, that it would destroy the local economy, and of course there would be nothing to live off these lands anymore. But if you think, I don't know, World War I, of course, take the Western Front, the areas were destroyed by bombing and all this stuff, but fundamentally were actually relatively at least few civilian casualties, and we're talking about fully industrialized societies there that could subsist troops for those 4 years without exclusively at least living off the land in a completely different supply system time. So von Clausewitz is not renouncing to the idea that this is a flexible thing as it's been in the past, right? And of course he says that even in his own times, were there the conditions to fight for entire years in a single place, right? Of course, it would be necessary to recur to that, but it's exactly the point. Were there reasons to fight like that at the time? No. Right, it had come to one point in which this thing had been dramatically modified, fluidified. And in fact, just speaking of World War I, the prejudice of still the Napoleonic ideal of war, of movement, of action, this obsession with maneuvering, that was, let's not use words like obsession. I mean, the military was actually, aware of the changes at the time, just didn't know how it would have unfolded, but, even if there were mistakes, still the point was that warfare had changed in a way that it's properly, here the Clausewitz concept has eventually historically ended up being even World War I. It's a matter of ratio of strength, right? It's not because war changes in an unmodifiable way. Von Clausewitz is the epitome of the fluidity of war, right? Of the crystallized character of this thing that changes in everything. It has a chameleon-like nature, as he says. So he is, by approximating this, he shows always this double thread. That one thing is the theory, one thing is the practice, and in order to know what the practice is about, you have to understand why this happens in theory as well. And a theory that is based on practice, however, so that this may seem, what has followed the series since the beginning knows very well the coherence of this, though, and the extremely the most practical character of it than any other theory in the art of war. So much that's why we use it still today universally in every country. But once again, it's something that is easy to misunderstand from from the non-Clausewitzian basis that we generally speaking have, or better, the fact that we don't have any Clausewitzian base, and that's bad, naturally. So von Clausewitz says then, but here naturally arises the question, shall the war prescribe the system of subsistence, or shall the latter dictate the nature of war? That's what I was saying about the beginning, about the logistics, right? The war is just about logistics, right? No, it's not, right? And it's not even the most important thing. And von Clausewitz says, to this we answer, the system of subsistence will control the war, in the first place, as far as the other conditions in which it depends permit, right? It's like floating on right? It's as if you had, I often make the metaphor of the tip of the iceberg, right? It's not just because that's what you see, that there's nothing behind. War is subsisted by dramatically, macroscopically and unmeasurable, even at a certain point, political, social, and military issues. Logistics, as big as it may sound, is just a tiny part of it, right? And even if in the way war is actually waged, it's obviously always there because these armies have to eat, and otherwise they can't work. At the same time, the forms of this will change on the basis of what all these other factors have put, right? It's the same reason why, in fact, in World War I, we had a front that, didn't move for a few miles from Switzerland to the North Sea for 4 years, while, I don't know, in East Africa it was different, in the Eastern Front was different, and why? Technology was the same. Logistical systems in that sense were basically the same. So what the hell, right, are we talking about? No, logistics, speaking of logistics, is important, is crucial, must be studied, it's an important thing, but that doesn't say basically anything alone about what warfare is about, right? And the theory, the art of war, and the art of war proper, how you actually command an army, how you wage war, right? That's another thing. And I particularly stress this because I believe there is a deep misunderstanding out there about such issues, right? It sounds philosophical to say it's not all, but the hard fact tells you that it's all. No, it's literally not all. It's not even the most important thing, but not even by not even closely, right? And this is one of the most sound and concrete statements you can make. In fact, von Clausewitz says, but when the latter, that is, the other conditions, are encroached upon, the war will react on the subsistence system, and in such case determine the same. Right? It's easy to have armed forces integrated into a political and social system that knows how to feed them on a regular basis, so you have that logistical form. But were war to change because you got war in situations you have no idea how they will turn out, where then war takes over logistics, of course, and determines it. And it crushes everything that existed before, and this wasn't clear through the history of warfare. In the history of mankind. Please check any war and look at how it's something that changes at every moment. So von Clausewitz says, and it's beautiful the way he phrases that, right? Because even here you notice the double thread. He doesn't says that logistics doesn't influence, of course, but of course it does. But what is, in comparison to the rest, and how and why is logistics forming that way in the first place? Because obviously there are causes that form that, right? It's not just feeding the guys, right? It's how you fight a damn war. And that thing, and now we'll explain better, because von Clausewitz says, a war carried on by means of the system of requisitions and local supplies furnished on the spot has such an advantage over one carried on in dependence on issues from magazines, as we were saying before, that the latter does not look at all like the same instrument. No state, listen, because this is fascinating, no state will therefore venture to encounter the former with the latter, and if in any war minister should be so narrow-minded and blind to circumstances as to ignore the real relation which the two systems bear to each other, by sending an army into the field to live upon the old system of magazines, the force of circumstance would carry the commander of that army along with it in its course, and the requisition system would burst forth of itself. That is to say, try to make the army work logistically as lived back in the day, in the prearranged fashion. Right here, naturally, von Clausewitz is addressing the problem of, now we'll speak of, what the consequences of these are, but what he's telling us is something deeper at the level of theory of the art of war. He's telling us that it doesn't matter what you wish this thing could work like, you have to feed those men, and things will start running short, not just because people will not want to pay for that at home, or because it will create much more complications as a system that is much more complex and will bring to much greater shortcomings, and therefore, as we'll see, states normally cannot afford that, and therefore, as a consequence, troops will be forced to literally require food on the ground, let's say, by themselves. The thing will take over by itself. War will dictate that to logistics, right? And this really gives you the magnitude of the complexity and the complication of war, right? That ever changes, but at the same time has its own rules and goes by those normal, right? So there is always a tendency here. Here is what everything can change, yes, but it doesn't mean you can't have a theory, because you know in practice what will happen, and you have to focus on that and on the evidence that we have, which is military history, that we have seen how crucial it is in building, methodological in building the theory of the art of war. And von Clausewitz says, if we consider besides that the great expense attending such an organization must necessarily reduce the extent of the armament in other respects, including of course the actual number of combatant soldiers, as no state has a superabundance of wealth, then there seems no probability of any such organization being again resorted to unless it should be adopted by the belligerents by mutual agreement, an idea which is a mere play of the imagination. This is also very fascinating, because it speaks about the faux asymmetry of warfare in any kind. Symmetric warfare never existed. It cannot exist, simply because we live in a physical world. And so von Clausewitz is simply saying, what were the reasons that could bring, therefore, at this moment to a reinstatement of the magazine system of supplies? I mean, just two states that agree to fight like that, but the question is, why would they, right? If they are clashing, especially with the political and social capabilities of 19th century states, mass levies, etc., what would be the point of making it nicer, therefore prolonging the war, and definitely with enormous costs of mass scale, avoiding to, not to try to hit the enemy in that, could be his own weakness, and the obvious difference that would stand between the countries, even on a logistical base, to resort to it doesn't make any sense. Even if it hadn't been the actual, for the actual sake of the feeding of the troops that require, at this time in history, such kind of subsistence system, right? This is extremely important to understand, because here it's the sap of the Clausewitzian theory. It's really what, here by input, it spills tiny drops, but nevertheless, what it gets down to in real war. And von Clausewitz says, therefore, may be expected henceforward always to commence with the requisition system, right? So wars will, on a regular base, actually at that point in history, start from the idea that the moment you start, but even if we are in friendly territory, you get fought with mostly the requisition system and other systems that can be, that can help, and that's including magazines that are still used, but in a proportion that is much that doesn't dictate, in fact, how the thing goes. And von Clausewitz says how much one or other government will do to supplement the same by an artificial organization to spare their own country, etc., remains to be seen. This is important, in fact, because even in friendly territory, naturally, you don't want to strain too much the local populace because of subsistence problems. But as we've seen in the previous paragraph, in friendly territory, it's dramatically easier to make stuff coming from other communities around, right? Even in ways that are not pre-planned through magazines. So actually, and especially given the speed on friendly territory, the actual amount of supplies required to the local populace is very low. And in theory can be low even for other places in what we've seen the average European theater of these times. And von Clausewitz then says That it will not be over much, we may be certain. That is to say, even here magazines will not necessarily have, in case you were just to prepare them not to strain too much the local resources in friendly territories, it's not even necessarily something practical, right, for the same country that is paying for it, right? For such moments, the tendency is to look to the most urgent ones. An artificial system of subsisting troops does not come under that category, right? Yeah. But now, if a war is not so decisive in its results, if its operations are not so comprehensive as is consistent with its real nature, then the requisition system will begin to exhaust the country in which it is carried on to that degree that either peace must be made, or because literally you can't fight anymore, or means must be found to lighten the burden on the country and to become independent of it for the supplies of the army. The latter was the case of the French army under Bonaparte in Spain, but the first happens much more frequently. In most wars, the exhaustion of the state increases to that degree instead of thinking of prosecuting the war at a still greater expense. The necessary for peace becomes so urgent as to be imperative, because literally at some point your forces will start to melt away. Thus, from this point of view, the modern method of carrying on war has tendency to shorten the duration of wars. This is particularly important. Before I didn't comment when he said what we had actually already hinted at, that the idea that countries normally. So what's von Clausewitz saying here? He says, you go out there to fight in a land and you start ravaging it, and it goes on for years, and so the land literally exhausts itself. Right? There are certain lands in Europe that after Napoleonic Wars, had been rich for centuries and centuries, kind of began to decline at some point, for the sheer magnitude of, not just because of supplies, but simply, because the French, sacked everything, but to solve their yearly economical problems at the time of the revolution, since the time of revolution and before. But at a certain point, your army will literally melt. I mean, either you retreat or melts away. So in the moment in which you retreat, usually, whichever reason you had been there, sounds like, unless the other country has it's not motives to take over you and to invade you in turn, which would happen in this context, as during the Napoleonic era, it's pretty evident. But it would bring to at least an end to that kind of objective, broader invasion from one side, and possibly even to peace at that point, at least a momentary level. And we've seen how fluid that this thing still is, right? But the deep point that von Clausewitz is making, especially with the last phrase, that is, thus from this point of view the modern method of carrying on a war has a tendency to shorten the duration of wars, recalls us what von Clausewitz said at the very beginning of Vom Kriege, and that we will be in fact addressing to the next lines, in which he discussed that is about the humanitarian aspect of war, or better, the fact that if there is somebody who believes that wars can be more humanitarianly fought, the least intense they are, is wrong, is actually doing an anti-humanitarian business, because it's prolonging the war, and therefore causing, in interest of time, and actually in proportion, a much higher degree, and actually in absolute degree, a much greater amount of damage, human lives, destruction, and so on. What von Clausewitz is telling us here is that this method of subsisting, it may appear actually less merciful, because considering what happens to the local population where the army crosses. And this is also true up to a certain point, because we have seen how on a regular basis in the Napoleonic War this was not true. Like the idea that especially these speedy maneuvers, speedy marches, etc., allowed the countryside not to be crippled in terms of productivity, because literally you could this system, exactly the system of requisition, allowed to leave off the land, so to go on without maintaining the troops on the spot and consuming literally everything, right? Even at the every stock, the provisions for the winter and so on, right? So it was actually a positive thing altogether, but also it was because the war became much shorter, right? For Clausewitz says it here, these wars tended, and it said it also in the last paragraphs we have read, towards that absolute that we've seen what it means in the theory, in the Clausewitzian theory, That is fundamentally the idea that war should be free of all its constraints in order to be more effective and therefore to be as immediate as possible and therefore less, at the moment extremely more violent, but in interest of times, we're saying here, however, still causing less damage in total, which is at the end of the day what you really want to happen, right? This is based on naturally the intensity of war from as an instrument of politics. So whatever the moral reasons that have pushed to that to happen, logistics, as we've just remembered before, is just a secondary or tertiary aspect of it in proportion. But were we to look just in logistical terms, actually this form of subsistence is more human altogether than something more complex, right? That would require much more strength to everybody, in a sense, or at least to those who actually will pay for that war in practical terms. Beautiful concept here. So von Clausewitz says, at the same time, we shall not positively deny the possibility of the old system of subsistence reappearing in future wars. So here the smart guy points out, of course it happened, and it happened even recently. And von Clausewitz saw that in a way during the Dutch campaigns in the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars, and it says it will perhaps be resorted to by belligerents hereafter, where the nature of their mutual relations urge them to it, and circumstances are favorable to its adoption. So here von Clausewitz is open even to what, in fact, we were saying before happened during World War I. And this is yet another proof that von Clausewitz is not a guy who's telling you about 19th century war, early 19th century war. He's actually telling you what war is, and he's explaining you how it happens at every time. He says here, at this moment it functions like that, logistically speaking, but in the past it was different. In the future, it may be different again, right? Tendency doesn't seem like to be at the moment, because of course, for a person that fought through all the Napoleonic wars, he had seen what the hard reality of war was about, and it was, structurally, systematically about that form, but can change. It can change, as it changed from the previous century, right? And von Clausewitz says, but we can never perceive in that system a natural organization, right? This is also important. He's saying that basically the system of magazines is still simply it has more steps. It's something that requires altogether more energies in its conceptions, right? Because you have to organize all a system of supply that goes beyond what can be stripped from the countryside at that moment. It could be enough, right? So by itself it already entails a more complicated way of dealing with it, or at least a greater cost. That, once again, one time might become more effective, as we've seen, but that at the moment is not. And still today our armies ravage, we can say. So, right? So it is much rather an abnormal growth permitted by circumstances, von Clausewitz says, but which can never spring from war in its true sense. Right? At that moment, this is actually a very contextual phrase, right? So even here, do not take it as von Clausewitz is saying, it's just the here the thing is subtle, because what he means here is that even when there will be a system of magazines that will allow this kind of logistical system to be standing, still that properly has nothing to do with the what the spring of war is like, right? It's really about the motivation that brought the war to be fought that makes the thing, right? And it's not necessarily that logistical form. Even when even in von Clausewitz's times, that not even the requisition system in itself is what makes the thing done. I don't know if I explained myself right. In proportion of war, in its true sense, this thing is still relative in importance, and it's properly something that can adapt to circumstances. War takes over. And von Clausewitz says, still less can we consider that form or system as an improvement in war on the ground of its being more humane. We're talking about still magazines and what we were saying before, for war itself is not a humane proceeding. very punching phrase, war itself is not a humane proceeding, right? What he's saying here is not that war is not humane in the sense that you can't fight for people's freedom against to crush tyranny and free from oppression. But here saying that the proceeding of war, that is how you have to do it, is not meant to be humane. On the contrary, we have seen that in fact, the more humane it is, actually the more violent the proceeding must be, and at least the less humane it must be, right? It's something that goes deep to the core of civil values. It's like, do you accept torture? No, we can't because of human rights. Yes, okay, but think, I don't know, you catch a terrorist that knows where some bombs are going to blow up to kill people, and won't you torture him to let him know, to let authorities know where this is going to happen to save lots of other people's lives, everything to an end. And this is still a humanitarian thing because you're going to save people's lives. So whoever cares about what formally that idea of what people, because it's fashion, let's be honest, people like to believe in morals in the way that makes them feel this kind of fuzzy feelings inside. I mean, they don't reason on it, or they don't care, and that's why it's moral. It's inhuman in a sense, because that there is no intelligence in it, right? And therefore, we could go easily as far as saying that a person who believes that war has to be humane is not an intelligent person. And the fact that the guy will not understand the difference between, the reasons why you're fighting it and why you're fighting it is exactly the reason why he's not intelligent, right? And don't believe that people actually reason about this stuff. Most people reason in terms about, this is right or wrong because, I don't know, the side who fights it is more or less sympathetic to me. It's literally it. And finding formalistic excuse, but that guy actually killed that amount of civilians, as if collateral effects were a joke to you. I don't know, maybe you saved under 100,000 because of that, but, hey, you killed the bastard, killed those innocents. Well, that's exactly the abysmal level of intelligence is displayed there. Which has nothing to do with the fact that there is going to be a cost to all of this, that war is not to be taken lightly. That is to say, okay, let's kill, let's not care about stuff. No, of course we have to, because the consequences of these wars are not to be known easily. Actually, they can't be known. There is just something that is better you plan them, the better you know the situation, the better you'll do it, the better you'll control, right? Look at what happened in Iraq. I mean, at that point, you can't. The reason why that war was fought is something different from how it was fought. Because had it been fought better, actually today we may even talk about it as in positive terms. Instead, things went wrong because literally there were problems in that, how the thing was carried out, and this is a pretty good example of how. Not just the unpredictability, but actually also the seriousness of a consequence of actually, yes, causing such damage brings to, because the world is not the same, right? As it's not the same from a second to another in any other circumstances, for that matter. Surely those are issues that impact people's ideas, political opinions and so on. And this is said from a person that objectively tries to look at reality exactly the way I'm doing through the Vom Kriege, right? So it's not, I can't say I don't care, but of course I care up to the point, this enters my personal sphere. I mean, like any other person, like do you actually care about the fact that there are thousands and thousands of people that are starving to death, being raped, abused, and enslaved right now? No, you're doing anything, you're listening to my videos, right? But hopefully, exactly listening to this, is, waking you up in terms of not, go there to make the good Samaritan, but actually understand that there is a more intelligent way to cope with that, to actually make a greater good than, starting from an unsophisticated, primitive idea of just literally going there and, changing the world, right? I can't insert a Rambo quote in such things, but, but the point here is it's concretely that, right? And after all, it's a simple thing to understand. It doesn't require much intelligence. I mean, let's be honest. We have read and commented the Vom Kriege together. Does it seem to you that it's so difficult to understand? I mean, the only difficulty it's the one we put to our own mind. And the walls, the limits, the boundaries that it's not we don't have the courage to cross or the internet, but literally we are too lazy to cross, and that's the first cause of evil, in my opinion. And we can all do better. So this is an important, I think, moral realization. So Dan von Clausewitz says, whatever method of providing subsistence may be chosen, it is but natural that it should be more easily carried out in rich and well-developed countries than in the midst of a poor and scanty population. This is obvious. This is what we've already seen about the demographic density and the fact that normally, aside from the per capita wealth, there is always, to leave of something in places where people live. So that the population, von Clausewitz says, should be taken into consideration lies in the double relation which that element bears to the quantity of provisions to be found in a country. First, because where the consumption is large, the provision to meet that consumption is also large, and in next place, because as a rule, a large population produces also largely. From this we must certainly accept districts peopled chiefly by manufacturers, particularly when, as is often the case, such districts lie in mountain valleys surrounded by unproductive land, right? Not just in a city maybe that is specialized in banking, but that exactly for that reason may still have plenty of resources to buy food there. So this is the example here of the mountaineers that just live of exports, but still do not do it in great material wealth or with great amount of resources around. It's a great it's a point of strategic concern, because we've seen that these large armies tend naturally to fight in places that are like flatlands, the agricultural, the rich flatlands, and going to fight in a mountain is strategically normally doesn't make much sense. The larger the army is, right, and the greater achievements you wanna reach, right? So, but this is another thing. But in the generality of case, in fact, Clausewitz says it is always very much easier to feed troops in a well-populated than in a thinly inhabited country. So we perfectly agree. And an army of 100,000 men cannot be supported on 400 square miles inhabited by 400,000 people, as well as it would be on 400 square miles with a population of 2 million inhabitants, even supposing the soil equally good in the two cases, right? So this is punching. Besides, the roads and means of water carriage are much better in rich countries and afford a greater choice, being more numerous the means of transport and more abundant, the commercial relations easier and more certain. In a word, there is infinitely less difficulty in supporting an army in Flanders than in Poland, right? And this is self-explanatory. The consequence is that war, with its manifold succors, fixes itself by preference along high roads near populous towns, in the fertile valleys of large rivers, or along such sea coasts as are well frequented. So this is also clear. So von Clausewitz is listing just, the richer the places are, the more accessible, the better it is for subsisting the army. I mean, there is not much to understand about it. So this shows clearly, von Clausewitz says, how the subsistence of troops may have general influence upon the direction and form of military undertakings, and upon the choice of a theater of war and lines of communications. So that's why this is important. This is relevant for the theory of the art of war, because this is going to influence the choices you're going to make. In other words, remember that thing of logistics. Nobody denies the importance of logistics, but still, when thinking about the theory of the art of war, first of all, you could screw up completely. Even if you had a fully supplied army, you can still fail miserably, right? And if war was just about logistics, we would have solved all a great part of war's problems, we would say, because we would know how to do. At that point, there would be no game. But it's not like this, because war is, continuation of politics, social systems. They are dramatically volatile, fluid, changeable, and the range of things that can happen go by far, infinitely far from logistics. And as a consequence, however, you must understand in the theory of the art of war that where you have to move the army is a matter also of how the hell you're going to supply it, which doesn't mean to be a logician, right? To be a logistician, I don't know how to say that, a logist. It means to actually know that those who are in charge of that need those local resources to make the army work, and it will work, right? Also, it's I must say, in fact, logistics is one of the most underestimated fields as far as military history is concerned, considering the fact that, in fact, these are kind of a ministerial business, right? These are taken care by, not by the great officers, right? Those can make the choice of going in a place or another on the basis of how much the army is going to be supplied, but how it worked mechanically, we know a few, and people also care about a few. So in this sense, indeed, logistics is something that must be reevaluated, but do not confuse it with the theory of the art of war, because that's another kettle of fish, right? So here, von Clausewitz says the extent of this influence, in fact, of the availability of resources, what weight shall attach to the facility or difficulty of provisioning the troops, all that in the calculation depends very much on the way in which the war is to be conducted. So that is, it's not just, war is not, again, a matter of, whether you can fight in a place where more or less supplied. That war could be fought even in places where there is not much, actually, to leave of. And this is actually pretty well clear to, as for Clausewitz will see later, how but by all the privations that normally soldiers and armies undergo, even in places that are supposedly to be, here we're always talking about places that can basically support, on average, the army. But there are countries that are entirely ravaged when war is fought on it. So this gives you the dimension. So what do? You don't fight war? Well, it can happen, yes. As von Clausewitz himself said, if the army starts melting away, yes, you retreat. But in other cases, there are other ways. Magazines can be the response to it, right? But also, this is something we're seeing, for example, much in certain limited theaters where there are, I think about proxy wars. I mean, big powers that actually back troops to fight in a context that is not even of regional, but let's say provincial scale. Right, and you understand there that logistics is crucial. How many ATGM you bring on the field, right? How many tanks you can blow up in places where normally you wouldn't find anything of that available otherwise. So in that sense, of course, logistics informs war, right? But at the same time, the reason why war is being fought in those places, in those conditions, is still something that supersedes that, right? You understand which are the layers the war is to be studied like. Otherwise, you will think it's just about logistics, and hell, it's not, right? And it's always about finding new means. It's finding new, let's say, new dimensions, new levels at which to compensate what the enemy can bring for, right? You bring logistics, maybe you don't have the same supplies the enemy has, so you have to invent something else. Doesn't mean that you're not taking the punch. It means exactly that because you take the punch, you're going to find another solution. And we'll talk about this when we'll see better the concept of Schwerpunkt, because that is what opens your mind, blows you, actually, because it's fundamentally what war is about, in the nature of putting the enemy always in a condition of inferiority, not independently on the situation, but in spite of, right, if you can, right? Yeah, so von Clausewitz says, I don't remember what we're reading here, the extent of this info, okay, we read this. So yeah, we've seen that these conditions inform the way war is conducted, is waged, so it also the theory of the art of war, naturally. If it is to be carried on its real spirit, von Clausewitz says, it is with the unbridled force which belongs to its element, with a constant pressing forward to, or seeking for the combat and decisive solution, and then we're talking about war, then the sustenance of the troops, although unimportant, is but a subordinate affair. as we said before. It's literally, it's like technology. You think that it matters what you have in your hands, or the will that you have to rip your enemy's guts off. It's obviously the second, right? The former can help, but war will not be about the former, right? Doesn't matter how impacting, how important a weapon is. It's also just simply, it's not even the technology, of course, it's the weapon and how you use it, and therefore the doctrine, and therefore lots of other things that imply that doctrine, that society, and that culture, and that understanding with the previous experiences of war, with what they expected will be. And we know how the margin of unpredictability, where you fight war, basically 3/4 of what is necessary for you to have a spot-on calculation, even a short range, are regularly unknown. So how can logistics be a thing? Right, that defines, dictates war in that sense. It doesn't matter how important, how pervasive it is. Here, everything compenetrates each other. Doesn't mean that you're even able to cognitively distinguish what is going to make the difference. At the end of the day, most of the times we don't even know, even when war is over. Actually, that's where also it gets historically fascinating. And then Clausewitz says, but if there is to be a state of equilibrium, during which the armies move about here and there in the same province for several years, then the subsistence must often become the principal thing, the intendant, the commander-in-chief, and the conduct of the war and administration of wagons. Right? So yes, this augments the more that scenario opens to reality. Then Foucault says there are numberless campaigns of this kind in which actually nothing took place. The plans miscarried, the forces were used to no purpose, the only excuse being the plea of want of subsistence. On the other hand, Bonaparte used to say, "Qu'on ne me parle pas de vivre," right? Do not talk to me about supplies. Exactly because of this reason, that's punching as a quote, because basically Napoleon was saying, are you even actually telling me about it, right? If you're going there with your army to accomplish something for specific strategical reasons, you can say it's because of supplies, right? It's because of something else that is way more important, right? So it's to all those who speak of logistics as the hail, the sanctity of the greatest and most intelligent, imprescriptible reality, just expert people really understand the deep core of war. Those are people who don't understand much about war in the first place. And Foucault says certainly that General Napoleon talking, the Russian campaign proved that such recklessness may be carried too far, for not to say that perhaps his whole campaign was ruined through the cause alone, which at best would be only supposition. Still, it is beyond doubt that to his want of regard to the subsistence of his troops, he was indebted for the extraordinary melting away of his army on his advance, and for its utter ruin on the retreat. This is punching as well. For are you thinking that Napoleon brought this concept too far to go out in Russia with satisfactory supplies at some level, that it was the cause of his defeat? Right? It's like those people who believe that Napoleon was defeated because of winter. Napoleon wasn't defeated because of winter. Napoleon was defeated because of the Russians, right? And when people concentrate to the mono factorial thing, they literally, you can know that they do not understand. They do not know, they do not know this stuff. They've never conceived that. They've never thought about it. They do not know. They can't accept that reality is a complex thing. Hence, they cannot understand history on that base, right? And so much it is important to me to stress this. Really, you won't believe how many people make this mistake all the time and with no evidence, right? You see, sometimes when you have a question, you say, but is this or that? But the reason why you ask that is because you don't know, right? But most people just say, no, it's that because I convinced myself it is that, even if I do not know that. So it's fine to ask, it's fine to seek for an explanation. But once you got it, you know that posing yourself that question was not a bad thing. it's right to be curious, etc. But it's because you properly didn't understand that picture. Not because you had a point by stating the two hypotheses as, they all make sense. No, because eventually reality supersedes that. It goes beyond. It brings it to another level that makes you see the thing in perspective and says, okay, it wasn't that, right? There wasn't even a logic to that. Then von Clausewitz says, but while fully recognizing in Bonaparte the eager gambler who ventures on many a mad extreme, we may justly say that he and the revolutionary generals who preceded him dispelled a powerful prejudice in respect to the subsistence of the troops, and showed that it should never be looked upon in any other light than as a condition of war, never as an object. Right? Now I would make a frame to this paragraph because it's so linear, limpid, and kind of easy, right? In the way it simply completely bunks all the thing. There you understand the freaking genius of this man. You understand the freaking genius of von Clausewitz from the simplicity of it. Never think that this is difficult. Right? The only difficulties are the ones that we create artificially to ourselves in our minds without even being asked. And von Clausewitz says, besides, it is with privation in war just as with physical exertion and danger, the demands which the general can make on his army are without any defined bounds. An iron character demands more than a feeble, sensitive man. Also the endurance of an army differs in degree according as habit, military spirit, confidence in and affection towards the commander, or enthusiasm for the cause of the fatherland, sustain the will and energy of the soldier. But this we may look upon as an established principle, that the privation and want, however far they may be carried, should never be otherwise regarded than a transition states, which should be succeeded by a state of abundance, indeed even by superfluity. This is one of the single most beautiful things I read from Clausewitz. Right, and it goes on, and we explain it all together, because it says, can there be anything more touching than the thought of so many thousand soldiers, badly clothed, with packs on their backs weighing 30 or 40 pounds, toiling over every kind of road, in every description of weather, for days and days continually on the march, health and life forever in peril, and for all that unable to get a sufficiency of dry bread? Anyone who knows how often this happens in war is at loss to know how it does not oftener lead to a refusal of the will and powers to submit any longer to such exactions, and how the mere bent constantly given to the imagination of human beings in one direction is capable of first calling forth and then supporting such incredible efforts. Right. This is did you understand what he says? Basically stating, do not think that for this here is on the wake of what we were saying on Napoleon, right? Pushing your army to the extreme. That can be riskier, but the risk is proportionate to what you want to achieve. The humanitarian concept of it, the idea that should be the way war should be fought. Doesn't matter whether you win or lose, or better, of course, you're fighting to win. But the question there is not necessarily that if you're bolder, you're necessarily going to have less impact on the enemy. Quite on the contrary, many circumstances. But aside from that, there is also this strain, right? This moment where everything starts getting gloomier, right? And this always pick the Vom Kriege also as a psychological survey and as actually a philosophy of life, in a sense. Never think that in the darkest hour, we can all relate to have faith at some point. That situation is gonna last forever. It's not final, right? Even if it was, it's still happening for some reason. It will pass. When it will pass, you realize how important it was to hold, right? Not to give up, not to throw away when things become hard, right? And you say, we're not going to make it, right? We're going to lose. That's exactly the moment in which you know that the greatest effort is required. It's it's exactly there the problem. It's when you feel more uncertain that you need that vision, that focus, that determination to say, it's exactly because I know this is the hardest moment that I have to insist the most, because this is the moment in which it will pass. It's just a transitional phase, and when we'll go through the other side, we will have achieved way more than we imagined had we hold on. And von Clausewitz says that this is also a real psychological thing, excuse me, that it happens because of what, to everybody, right? And here he's talking, as we'll see, also specifically of the commander, and this idea that the troops are tired and it's ever more difficult to achieve something there. But he says that even this in the army, everybody who has served knows that it's that what the strains here we're talking about, this incredible thing of these guys marching with tens and tens of kilos on their backs, in risking to die at any moment, for being exhausted physically, having really being psychophysically broken, but still not broken actually, and how much that the exposure to those perils and difficulties actually makes them tougher to go on and on and on, and how much can be drawn from a person, how much strength, how much awareness, how much lucidity from having experienced such a distress. Because he knows that whatever is going to happen in the future has never been as hard as that, and that they know they can endure that. And how often this happens in war is basically the worst experience in human reality in terms of concentration, of deprivations and pain and suffering. That can't serve to anything that we go through in life in a way that to us can feel like the end of the world, but that is actually something that we think of that because we haven't experienced an ever harder reality. And it's from that realization that we will be better, that we will grow stronger, right? And this is real because it happens like that for real in war, right? It's not about because we were lucky that all the in the history of mankind it happened like that. It's just because those were tougher guys than us. No, we're the same people. We are identical, and all that changes there is what happens in our minds when we are exposed to those problems, right? So never forget this. This is one of if the Vom Kriege could be translated into a life philosophy, it would be exactly this, right? Even if it costs, what you have to achieve in life. This is also what modern psychology tells us. It's not about being happy. It's about having accomplished something, right? It's not giving up to laziness, to indolence, to this sense that okay, it's been so hard, and after that I want to relax. Yes, in good healthy order, that is to say, we all need to relax at a point, we need to stop at a point, but still, it's not to stop forever. It's just to stop a while, regather force, and restart, and going on, and realizing that we are stronger than before, we can achieve more than before, and as a consequence, we can live better than before. We can be better people than before. This is fundamental, right? Once you get the Vom Kriege, if you don't get the mechanics of this all, but the importance, the excruciating realization that our world could be a far, but I mean a multiple times better place than one it is if we only entered this mindset for everybody. It's something that really makes you wonder, why don't we strive to be better people every day, right? And that's what I tell you from a personal point of view. Now, may not be interested, but actually this is actually the most important thing I drew from the Vom Kriege, right? That it gave me the realization that when you're in doubt, do not doubt, right? Be intelligent about it. Do not do stupid things, but at the same time, when you've chosen a path, follow it. That's what von Clausewitz says when he talks about the cognitive limits of war. That is to say, if you feel undecided, because in war, that's the moment if we are undecided by par excellence, right? That is exactly the moment in which, even if you chose the wrong path, that still could be, not completely wrong. I mean, you could, there are different ways to get to a point, and what's that point? is going to see. Nobody knows. That's exactly the idea. You don't let you being stopped by uncertainty, by regret, right? Go that way, right? And do not think about it at the beginning, but once you've thought about it, you've taken that way, go that way. Go that way and do not look back. Do not let yourself being stopped. Remain smart. Just know that that way is also going to have open to others, to other decisions, to other circumstances from which you will have to make other choices. But once you've chosen that path, go on with that. And this is also very powerful. We know it works like this, psychologically speaking, for humans, right? That's really the best advice you can give. And it's about really a moral dimension, right? It's about moral forces. When Von Clausewitz says that war is primarily about moral forces, this is exactly what it is. It's not about being the stronger. It's not about being the richer. It's not about being the luckier. It's about being the most resilient, the most determined. That's what is going to make concretely the difference. Even if you lose, right? That will have made a bigger impact at the end of the day. And who knows that if you are able to rise again, that won't be the key for another victory. If we want to reason in this world of uncertainty we live in constantly, and how our biological roots has built us to work, just know that that is the way. That is and it will always be. So be strong, think true on those tracks, and you'll make it. You'll make it, right? So then Von Clausewitz says, let anyone then who imposes great privations on his men, also this is important because of the concept of responsibility. He says, on his men, because great objects demand such a trial of endurance. We have read in the Vom Kriege what happens when things start to go wrong. Everybody starts doubting. The commander receives all these contradictory, feeds and so on. That's the moment in which you have to show you have massive control. And always bear in mind, Von Clausewitz says in these circumstances that as a matter of prudence, if not prompted to it by his own feelings, that there is a recompense for such sacrifices which he is bound to pay at some other time. That is to say, it doesn't matter how much you're straining yourself at the moment, apparently, and how hard and reckless this may sound, just know that the more you go on, still the more you will achieve, right? And this is, once again, not a magical formula for which everybody who behaves like this, does amazing things. But on average, it is. On average, right? And this is not talking about the purposes proper, but specifically about the modus agenda, we could say. This is how it works, right? And in war, it works. In war, it really makes more than any other thing, compare the difference between victory and defeat. Still, nobody gives you defeat. Nobody gives you victory for certain, not even close, unfortunately. But still, this is the best way to increase your chances in absolute terms. Before anything else, right? It's about determination and not being scared. Then Von Clausewitz says we have now to consider the difference. So because you're going to be rewarded afterwards. Also, this concept of the afterwards, I believe, excuse me if I interrupt myself, for the sake of following this video, might not be the best. But let's say it's the moment, it's the concept of the transience of this. The moment this is how the bad thing is happening, it's obvious for you to feel upset. It's obvious for you to feel down. It's obvious for you to say, okay, I give up, I can't take it. Then sometimes will pass, and that will show you that, it was worth it, right? That if I could go back then and tell, things are gonna get fixed, hold on, right? Everything would have been better even for me. And that is something that if you ever feel blue or something's going bad, and doesn't matter how tragic it is, it does really help, right? It can't spare you from suffering. It can't spare you from taking that blow, but it can give you the strength to rise again, which is, at the end of the day, to handle the situation. This is the most important thing for you. right? And some people break, right? And because we all have a breaking point, so it's normal also. Like defeats, failures, they all happen to everybody. What's the deal? We are humans. We are meant to cope with that, and this is our way. Mm? So this is important for moral boosting. That is exactly what we're searching for, as we've seen as an objective as a point for us. Then von Clausewitz says the defensive is in a position to make up uninterrupted. We have now to consider the difference which takes place in respect to the question of subsistence in war, according as the action is offensive or defensive. The defensive is in a position to make uninterrupted use of the subsistence which he has been able to lay beforehand as long as his defensive act continues. The defensive side therefore can hardly be in want of the necessaries of life, particularly if he is in his own country, but even in the enemy's this holds good, right? The offensive, on the other hand, is moving away from his resources, and as long as he is advancing, and even during the first weeks after the stops, must procure from day to day what he measures, and this can very rarely be done without wanton inconvenience being felt. All right, so this is naturally a relative statement, because it takes into consideration the average, right? It's obvious that even for a defender, it can happen to exactly maybe for leaving for remaining in a certain place for a prolonged time, as we've seen, actually bring to the exhaustion of resources. But this is an important point too, because von Clausewitz is implying that happens because he can't afford to stay there, because he knows that, because the pressure posed by logistics at that point would be felt much so otherwise. And it's instead the attacker that is to move, and therefore to seek always new sources of supply in that regard. That actually is more strained under this point of view, right? So the attacker has generally more difficulties from a logistical point of view on average than the defender. Then von Clausewitz says the difficulty is felt in its fullest force at two particular periods. First in the advance, before the decision takes place, right? Then the supplies of the defensive side are all at hand, whilst the assailant has been obliged to leave his behind, because there is always this thing, of course, when you advance and you attack, even just not just from a strategical, probably from a tactical point of view, you're moving away from the actual source of supply. So if anything, you have to go back to get it. So it's that's really difficult, right? And that's where we have seen many battles where this is the case. You abandon the camp or go out for the battle, and you may have to cross kilometers before you reach the enemy in the day to fight the battle. That's how it normally happened, right? So it's not you can bring something with yourself, but it's not going to be enough until you come back to the camp for your army to stand on its feet again. Still, on that in interest of time. And in fact, von Clausewitz says the attacker is obliged to keep his masses concentrated and therefore cannot spread his army over any considerable space. Right, this is in strategical sense. He cannot survive, as we've seen in previous chapters, previous paragraphs. The more you're concentrated, more difficulties you have in finding food. Not just because in a local base you tend to consume more, so you can't spread troops in a larger space and leave off the land like that, but also because it takes more time to actually spread and to get that food, and also while you're on the move it gets complicated because you may not, you may mismatch the times and spaces there for supplying the troops. Von Clausewitz says even the attacker's transport cannot keep close to him when he commences his movements preliminarily to a battle. If these preparations have not been very well made, it may easily happen at this moment that his army may in a want of supplies for several days before the decisive battle, which certainly is not a means of bringing them into the fight in the highest state of efficiency. Right? So this is also for a good planning of subsistence before, exactly because of this also increase of shortage given you're abandoning your positions. Then von Clausewitz says the second time, so this is before the attack, second time state want arises at the end of the victorious career if the lines of communication begin to be too long. The overstretching of supplies line. This is a problem. Think of Blitzkrieg in the Eastern Front. That was a big deal, where their logistics was very important, right? And all the speaking of the first point, the first time they had, I mean, the Nazis has completely miscalculated the whole thing since the beginning, right? So you go nowhere if you in an industrial context you mismatch it, and especially this was already true at this point in history. So I mean, consider what it can be like. Guess how the war ended, right? And especially if the war is carried on in a poor, sparsely populated country, and perhaps also in the midst. Think about once again the Eastern Front World War II is a very good example, and perhaps also in the midst of a people whose feelings are hostile. Also, what an enormous difference between a line of communication from Vilna to Moscow, right? From Lithuania to Russia, on which every carriage must be forcibly seized, and a line from Cologne by Liège, Louvain, Bruxelles, Mons, Valenciennes, and to Paris, where a mercantile contract or a bill of exchange would suffice to procure millions of rations. Frequently has the difficulty we are now speaking of resulted in obscuring the splendor of the most brilliant victories, reduced the powers of the victorious army, rendered retreat necessary, and then by degrees ended in producing all the symptoms of a real defeat. Forage, of which, as we have before said, there is usually at first the least deficiency, will run short soonest if a country begins to become exhausted, for it is the most difficult supply to procure at distance on account of its bulk, and the horse feels the effect of low fitting much sooner than the man. For this reason, an over-numerous cavalry and artillery may become a real burden and an element of weakness to an army. And this is all in the condition, as we've seen, actually of a victorious situation, of somebody who is advancing speedily, as we've seen. That's why also the example of the Eastern Front is still fitting more than 100 years later, because it has specifically it's facing the same difficulties in practice from, as we've seen, scarcity of populace, few wealth, local level, the generally hostile feelings of the population, this difficulty of literally bringing the troops, the horses. I mean, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union on muleback, not on motorized vehicles. So that's really an important thing to realize. And so the question here is, consider, yes, logistics, always, right? But also understand that logistics works at those levels with that impacting force, because there is a much greater impacting force that goes beyond any logistical concern, right? Or at least it takes into consideration, maintains it for what it is, right? So do not be impressed more than much by the idea that logistics is such a crucial thing in the theory of the art of war, because it's not even properly part of it as such. It's just the consequences of it that are and the causes and consequences of it that make it have a sense by itself. Otherwise, it's not itself, right? And again, this is not to diminish its actual importance in absolute terms, which definitely is pretty evident, as we've seen today. Anyhow, beautiful park. This is one of, by far, at least, given the topic treated, right? These are punching things to read. We arrived basically at one half of the Vom Kriege. So we have other, almost, I don't know, we were at 300, 400 videos in the end if we make it to finish it. And it's really worth it, because it's a school of life in many ways. So for now, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.